Some films were harmed in the making of this podcast. Everybody, and welcome back for another scintillating episode of For Your Consideration, the podcast featuring roundtable discussions reevaluating the cinematic canon of past masterpieces and modern classics. I'm Mike Josick.
I'm Dustin Friesenad.
I'm Kat.
Thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
So as you guys can tell, we have a guest. So welcome back, Kat.
I had a great time last time. It's good to be back.
And last time, for anybody who doesn't know, was our Lord of the Rings Fellowship of the Ring episode, where Kat was our resident Middle-earth expert.
I wouldn't go that far, because that's a serious title that people, knife people over.
And
Stephen Colbert will get into a fight with you.
Don't ever tell Stephen Colbert that I've been called that. I'll be murdered.
And at the time, we decided, even though the other movies are not on any of the other lists, we would continue. We would finish off the series. I think most of us found it difficult taking Fellowship sort of out of context. I remember, me personally, it was not the movie that I remembered, possibly because we watched the theatrical versions. Yeah, we're watching the theatrical versions of all of these films because, as some of you may know, we try and stick to whatever was kind of released and made the first impressions on people, not the director's cuts or final cuts. Although we do make exceptions occasionally.
And that was actually challenging for me here because I think for a lot of people the extended editions are the canonical versions of these movies. They're the versions that we watched over and over again
and this
with
week,
our friends in our basement.
This week Kat has watched The Four Towers.
Yeah, I've watched a grand total of 4 towers over a grand total of 7 hours. So
Kat's actually in a unique position where she watched both the extended version and the theatrical version this week.
Because I forgot I had to watch the theatrical version.
So she has
Whereas
noticed...
I've never seen the extended myself.
So Kat has noticed differences that she may not have picked up on had she just gone straight to the theatrical. So I'm curious to find out where maybe some of those discrepancies are...
Absolutely.
But...
So I'm not supposed to talk about stuff that wasn't in the theatrical version?
Well, when it comes to the final arbitration, we're not looking at the extended version, so...
So it doesn't matter that Belo Quelm have at the Freone Frecon forth onsended? Yet Shulan Singon Cleo Mensor Yend. It's seriously my favorite scene. It's my favorite scene, and it's not in the theatrical version. And when I was in university studying Old English, we translated that song,
Eowyn's Dirge, for those who do not know.
But I'm not allowed to talk about it.
No, we can talk about it. It's just...
It was Drickley Dearest and Maya Dearost.
We can't stop you.
You cannot. I've just demonstrated this.
Mike can edit you out, but...
This is true.
And should.
And he will suffer for it when you come by and lynch him.
Oh, look at those spikes on the waveform. Oh.
So I can't remember where I was, but...
You were introducing the movie.
So this week we're continuing with the Lord of the Rings movies, and today we're going to be talking about The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers.
A.K.A. that movie where the disenfranchised peasantry and the former slaves rise up against the Empire.
A.K.A. Orthanc and Minas Morgul.
Isn't that the same dumber you had for, Jaws or something, or some other movie we did recently?
No, there was one ridiculous one. I can't remember what it was.
It had some sort of, communist...
Oh, no.
Yes, something about communism.
Dustin.
And I was like, are we talking about the same movie?
And I had to explain it somewhere, and that was the stinger.
That's kind of just his default, really, approach to things. Sorry you had to hear that, Internet.
That's going to be cut, actually.
Sorry, not sorry.
Okay, so let's roll the credits on Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers. It was directed by Peter Jackson, produced by Peter Jackson, Barry Osborne, and Fran Walsh. Screenplay was by Peter Jackson, Fran Walsh, Philippa Boyens, and Stephen Sinclair. Of course, based on The Two Towers by J.R.R. Tolkien. It starred Elijah Wood, Ian McKellen, Viggo Mortensen, Liv Tyler, Sean Astin, Cate Blanchett, John Rhys Davies, Bernard Hill, Christopher Lee, Billy Boyd, Dominic Moynihan, Orlando Bloom, Hugo Weaving, Miranda Otto, David Wenham, Brad Dourif, Carl Urban, and Andy Serkis. Music was by Howard Shore. Cinematography was by Andrew Lesney. It was edited by Michael Horton and Jabez Olson. It was distributed by New Line Cinema and was released on the 5th of December, 2002 and wide release on the 18th of December, 2002.
All in one take for that big spiel of verbal
I'm
name
legit
diarrhea.
impressed. Same thing happened in Fellowship. It was real good. Real good.
So normally we hand off the initial reactions to Dustin, but because we have a guest trumps all. So, Kat?
We kind of agreed last time when we were talking about Fellowship that The Two Towers is the best movie.
I didn't agree to that. I just said that I'm kind of expecting that might be the case because Fellowship
Was your
underwhelmed
favorite?
me. Fellowship was my favorite and underwhelmed me. My memories of Return of the King are not great, so I assumed that Two Towers would be the one that would sort of stand out for me.
Default.
Like,
Occam's Razor.
I've watched these movies a billion times. I recently, for a class assignment, watched them another billion times. We were analyzing Aragorn's leadership style because, you know, other people in the class picked legitimate world leaders, but that's neither here nor there. And, like, coming fresh off rewatching the trilogy, The Two Towers is my favorite. It kind of always was. And on a rewatch, it didn't let me down. Like, I mean, I may be cutting to the chase a little bit, but I genuinely think this is a much stronger movie than Fellowship in a lot of ways.
And I don't think you're jumping the gun, Kat, because technically this movie, I mean, we're not...
We've already sort of agreed that they're all one big movie in 3 parts.
We did when we talked about Fellowship, even though we're kind of looking at them separately on their own merits. And also, Fellowship was the only one that sort of really fell under the purview of the show and the analysis. This is just kind of for fun.
Oh.
So technically, you know, we can throw the structure to the 4 winds if we wanted to.
Not that we haven't done so before.
This one's non-canonical.
It's kind of non-canonical.
For your consideration, Gaiden.
If November is canonical, this is canonical.
November is not canonical other than the original Starship Troopers.
Then doesn't that throw off the 50th episode anniversary edition?
No, because it was still a film analysis podcast episode per episode. It's just those particular films.
There's like so many lists now. Oh.
So where does the extended universe fit in here?
The extended universe goes on the Facebook page and the YouTube channel.
Right. That's right.
The extended universe is my novel review podcast.
Oh, I thought that was all of our sub-podcasts. So many extended universes.
Well, it's a large franchise.
I had kind of a surprisingly complex reaction to this movie. I think I want to hear Dustin's point of view before I get into anything.
You got words you're going to try to coalesce there?
I've got a lot of words. I don't think Kat's going to love all of them.
Oh, stoked about that.
Kat rarely does.
That's true. I'm going to bully you no matter what. Like, that's a fact.
So, Dustin, Two Towers, what was your initial reactions?
I have only ever seen all 3 of these movies when they initially came out and in theaters with my dad. Sort of, he'd come down, we'd all go watch them. And I always remembered Two Towers, A, being my favorite, and B, having just the most going on. You've got a number of battles all over the place. You've got the Ents coming out and taking down Isengard. You've got the battle at Helm's Deep. You've got the Riders of Rohan. Just action everywhere. And you've got a bunch of different little plots going on. Because, of course, the Fellowship is split up. You've got to follow Merry and Pippin. You follow Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli. You're following Sam and Frodo. There's all sorts of stuff happening everywhere. But watching it this time, I'm thinking how it's done pretty tight. You don't feel like it's ever focusing too much on any one. I don't feel like it's bouncing around all over the place in ways that lose you, that make things feel awkward. If anything, there's a few characters which you don't necessarily get to know, that don't grow as much, like poor Faramir.
Basically a cameo.
Basically a cameo.
He gets more in the extent...
No, we can we can drop extended cut bits like that.
Okay. I'm just really enjoying this restriction. It's funny to me.
Hell, throw in some book stuff if you like.
Oh, I'm gonna, though. That's gonna happen.
For me, like a lot of the things that you just mentioned, that's where sort of my complex reaction comes in, because as I said to you after I watched the movie, I feel that on every level this is a better movie than Fellowship. Acting, the direction, I feel this movie was made by a superior director
who didn't need as many
film.
Helicopter shots.
Absolutely. Like, there were so many things they relied on to kind of spoon feed you emotion and sentiment in the first movie, and they really relaxed on those here. he's just way more confident. I think he's way more confident as a director and as a storyteller, and that is something that I was very pleased with. And the first half an hour of this movie, I was like enraptured. I was thinking, here we go. This is going to be like the best one, just like we kind of predicted with in the last episode of the podcast where we talked about Fellowship. But you kind of said there was a lot going on, and I kind of disagree. I sort of feel like there were a lot of pieces being moved into the places that they needed to be in order for Return of the King to sort of play out the way it's supposed to play out. But I felt that those logistics sort of took control of the movie, and the character moments were sort of lost somewhat. You had to kind of fish for them. And there's like, these movies are renowned for the amount of walking in them. And I just was like kind of stunned at how much of this movie is characters and things moving rapidly from left to right or right to left, sometimes at each other. There were reservations, I guess, for me to just kind of jump out and be like, yes, this was the best one, because even though it's prettier and it's stronger and it's punchier, it still left me a little bit empty. Not as empty as Fellowship initially left me. I can see Kat getting visibly irritated. And I'm perfectly willing to like, maybe I'm just getting a little bit like numb. We talked about getting numb about movies off before we were recording. I kind of feel like that may have been the case, but I also feel like if the movie was as strong as it could have been, it would have, that wouldn't have made a difference, like if this, I made a comparison to Dustin last night where I said, there's the Empire Strikes Backs of the world and there's the Matrix Reloadeds of the world. By no means is the Two Towers a Matrix Reloaded, but it's not quite an Empire Strikes Back. I feel Empire Strikes Back moves all the characters and objects around the board, but there's a lot of emotion and dynamism and character stuff that's going on, so that when you get into Return of the Jedi, you can have a sloppy Jedi movie, but you're still so invested in these characters and you have so much like built up.
Then you can forgive stuff like the Ewoks.
You can forgive some of the sloppier things.
I think part of my reaction to that is that I think that The Two Towers is a subtler movie in a lot of ways than Fellowship. Like you mentioned how it was less manipulative. There are less of those huge bombastic orchestral strings telling you that it's time to feel. But there's Viggo Mortensen turns out a kind of surprisingly subtle performance in several scenes.
Viggo is aces in this movie.
Well, there's some scenes where I'd fight you, but for the most part, you're absolutely right. And so I don't know if the feelings presented are as huge, or if this is kind of a quieter, subtler movie in general than Fellowship. I like that about it. I think I was expecting to feel completely differently, because I was remembering a movie with a lot of very big, flashy action sequences and a lot of galloping. And as I'm rewatching it, I'm noticing that there's a lot of silence in this movie. There's a lot of characters saying things and just kind of leaving you to think about it. There's characters finding their place in the world not through speeches, but through watching other people they admire and coming to terms with the decisions and the statements of other people they respect. And it's like, I think it's lovely in that regard.
I'll agree with that.
It wasn't as adrenaline pumping as maybe I remembered it as a kid.
But that's not even what I'm kind of harping on. Like, for me, there were, like I said, there were so many just running at each other scenes or even sleeping. Like, this is going to be controversial, but I feel like this could have been a 2.5-hour movie rather than a 3-hour movie if they just took some of that extraneous stuff out. You didn't have to necessarily see every single step. And the frightening thing is, I know that there's like an hour of this movie that didn't even make it into the theatrical cut, and there's probably like hundreds of pages that didn't even make it into the film. But they could have transported Sam and Frodo into Faramir's hands more expediently, I think.
Whereas I'd say that I agree with Kat with the subtlety. The first one, you see all these huge helicopter shots, like, look at how epic everything is, and it's really thrown in your face. Whereas here, there's, I feel, just the right amount of walking to give you the notion that this is a big world. These are people going days and weeks at a time doing whatever the heck they're doing, without it just being, okay, they're there now. Okay, now he's here.
And like, I'm going to bust out the extended edition discussion as one major thing that I noticed. I was expecting to see scenes that were in the extended edition and weren't in the theatrical release. And there are a lot of those, but scenes are cut down with razor precision in the theatrical release. Like, there are sentences that are cut. Like, that's how fine a hand these editors had in putting together the theatrical version, like, they shaved anything they could. It was really interesting to watch, like, a sentence that continues in the extended edition very gracefully and invisibly cut. I think that the Sam and Frodo story is one of perseverance and exhaustion, and I think that if that had been expedient, you would have lost that fatigue that I think is core to Frodo's story.
They're supposed to be worn down by the ring and Sam having to carry him and just how far away it is without just them being, well, look, there's Mount Doom where nobody wants to go, but it's the one place where we want to be, sort of deal.
That's a fair point.
Damn right it is.
I mean, they're spending 3 movies walking there. You could just say, okay, we're here now. Bye, ring.
Call the Eagles.
Call the Eagles.
Ring, ring. Another reason this one was my favorite.
We don't mean Glenn Frey and Don Henley.
Wow. Wow. Another reason this one's my favorite is because my favorite culture in Middle-earth is Rohan. Ever since I was a kid, being one of those little girls who loves horses.
I was about to say.
Preteen horse girl.
Despite the allergy.
Okay, the allergy is a personal tragedy. Thank you. But I went to the musical ride, my eyes swelled shut. It was grueling. But it's also, as somebody who studied Old English literature and culture, it shows Tolkien's scholastic roots in the study of Old English. And they have this distinct warrior culture that's sensitive, but in a very grim and fatalistic way. I always just really enjoy watching the people of Rohan and kind of the Rohan-centric characters. I love King Theoden. I think he strikes this really great balance between being kindly and being very grim that you don't often see in, like, fictional kings. I loved Bernard Hill in this movie. And so, like, I think a big portion of my reaction to this is that it's concerning places and people and ideas that, like, are my favorite in Lord of the Rings.
Speaking of Theoden, I loved how haggard he looked. He looked fantastic when he was under Saruman's spell.
Have you ever seen the movie Santa Claus is Coming to Town?
I have not.
Okay.
I really enjoyed seeing Brad Dourif in this movie playing Wormtongue.
Yes.
I loved him at the time. I loved him watching it this time around. And just the subtle moments, like when, what the heck is Karl Urban's character's name? Éomer. When he was like, what possible, payment could you have for selling out your kingdom? And he does that subtle glance over to Éowyn, and it was just, that's just great acting and great direction.
Yeah. And Brad Dourif, I'm a huge Deadwood fan, and he's
brilliant. Staggering
in Deadwood. He's genuinely one of those.
I've yet to see a Brad Dourif performance that I didn't like.
Yeah, he's
honestly
genuinely a genius.
He's one of the best things in the Halloween remakes. He's Chucky.
The guy's amazing.
And
That's
Exorcist 3, like,
can't be beat.
X-Files. Sorry.
Yeah, no, this is legitimate. And Brad Dourif is Wormtongue, staggering. And the word I keep coming back to with this movie is subtle. It's the small little choices that the actors are making, the small choices in the sound direction that add up to a movie that I think leaves a lot more to the imagination than Fellowship did.
I will say that I felt that I was expecting, because I remember this movie just being a lot of, like you said, battle scenes. That's sort of what I expected going in, and I got a lot more out of this movie than I expected.
The battle scenes, they do feel way shorter than I remember.
Yeah, I agree.
But to their benefit.
And Helm's Deep is like an hour long or something. Like, it's a ridiculously long siege. There's no other way to really put it.
But as you guys were saying earlier, I was talking to both of you, and the battle scenes, the way that they're shot, it's, instead of, as Kat was saying, shaky cam, the high and low views.
Yeah. Because, like, somewhere in the mid-2000s, everyone realized that by shaking the camera around a lot...
It was Bourne.
Yeah.
Bourne Identity.
And then, like, did you ever see Public Enemies? The Dillinger biopic with John... That movie was unwatchable. I had to stare at the ceiling half the time. My motion sickness was so bad. But by shaking the camera a lot, you're conveying chaos. You're making it so but you look at the Two Towers, and, like, when Merry and Pippin are with the Uruk-hai, when the Rohirrim charge, and, like, the camera is low to the ground and very close. And so you're conveying chaos just by blocking most of the scene from our view. It's not physically unwatchable.
It's mostly sound design.
Right. And still, preserves that sense of something hectic and beyond our understanding happening without being physically unwatchable. And the Battle of Helm's Deep itself alternates between these close, chaotic shots, like Aragorn and Mealy, like looser shots that show the relationships of two characters, especially like on the wall when there's archers, and these much further, these helicopter shots that just kind of show the relationships of the armies and the relationships of the forces.
And the very interesting siege weaponry.
And by staggering between these, we get a balance of chaos and the adrenaline of war, but we also still get to understand what's happening. And I was really kind of blown away by how well handled that was.
I agree. And the music, too, was really good at kind of punctuating and underscoring that in a way where, unlike it did in Fellowship, in my opinion, and in some other places in this movie, it didn't overpower the scenes. It was just, everything was kind of, they were firing on all cylinders. The only point in Helm's Deep that I even took any issue with was at the very end where they were bashing the doors before coming into that last little bit of sanctuary that they had. And Aragorn was like talking Theoden up. He's like, let's get on our horses and let's ride out there. Let's just like give them hell. And yeah, it'll be like our last hurrah. And then the sun comes out and he just kind of remembers, oh yeah, we're like just biding time. We're supposed to wait until dawn and then look to the east. And I don't know, it felt like an awkward moment. And then Dustin likes to talk about Gandalf, a.k.a. Deus Ex Machina.
He's the Deus Ex Machina machine. Everything he does in his... DM of the Rings. Yeah, sorry? God from a machine. Machine. He's a machine that creates God from machines.
Okay.
I'm well aware what it means.
All right, go for it. Carry on. Sorry.
It reminds me wholeheartedly of the webcomic DM of the Rings, where he's just a thumb that comes around and does whatever the heck he wants, completely manipulates the plot in any way, and then disappears into the shadows a bit. In this one, it's not as bad, because he goes by and he basically, he's a carrier pigeon in this movie. He goes, he's like, okay, I'm going to let this guy know that he's supposed to do this. Let those guys know I'm alive. Oh, shit. Now I got to go get these riders over here to save the day in 5 days.
There's always that one guy, in this case it's usually Gandalf, who goes off to find that army that's just kind of hanging around idle that's going to come and save the day.
I personally would have sent that little kid, because I think Gandalf would have been more useful in the battle than this little kid. But,
yeah, but like, you can ambush the little kid. But...
and Gandalf's probably like, battle?
Yeah, but...
That is beneath me.
The funny thing is, Mike, that, like, in the books, that's exactly what happens. Like, Gandalf shows up, and Aragorn's like, oh, yeah, Gandalf's coming.
Doi.
Hey, guys, Gandalf's coming. I just remembered. And so, like, it had, when I first saw these movies, it had been a long time since I'd read the books. And now that I've reread Two Towers and watched Two Towers in close succession, no, like, Aragorn just kind of forgets. Like, there's a lot going on. He's got a battle to do. Like, oops.
He's got his girlfriend who he sort of left behind.
Gandalf's
he's having visions of.
Gandalf's cryptic advice
he's got his 2 girlfriends.
Well...
He's got the one girl that he's thinking of, and then he's got the other girl who's actually there.
And yet... but like, Gandalf's cryptic advice is not the first thing on his mind right now. He's got kind of other stuff to worry about.
I kind of feel like at this point, though, when Gandalf says something like, I'll be back and it'll be cool, they would sort of count on it.
This is true, but...
Speaking of Gandalf being cool, though, I was not upset at the fight with the Balrog. Because I always thought that it was kind of a ridiculous thing to go on. But it felt reasonable.
I agree.
This random wizard fighting some giant hellspawn. Minus the part where they fall down and end up on top of a mountain like it's Silent Hill 2.
Well, he says they're at the highest peak in, like, the lowest something. The highest peak of the lowest pit or something like that. But yeah, it still looked like they were outside. And
then he sees the cosmos, and then he comes back as Saruman. Speaking of him seeing the cosmos, though, one of my biggest quibbles with Fellowship is how very, very stupid some of the digital effects were.
Yes.
And there was significantly less ridiculous, like, overlaid nonsense in Two Towers than there was in Fellowship.
You didn't have Elrond's floating ghost head.
I mean, like, the ghosts in the marshes, I was like, did you draw those on cellophane and just kind of ripple it for the camera? But other than that, like... Even like, I remember you mentioned the in Fellowship, the birth of the Uruk-hai being very cheesy in Fellowship with the
it was handheld, and they would do like the shaky cam, and it almost looked like they went from like film to video or something. Like there was a different quality. Movie. Yeah.
But in the Two Towers, it wasn't
there.
Yeah, you just like you have like a normal eye level view of these Uruk pods falling out of the wall, and
this is what I was talking about, where it feels very much like a more confident filmmaker. Like I think they were trying things with the first movie, and they either became a little bit more sophisticated or a little bit more reserved, or I don't know what it was, but this is definitely a better made film and better storytelling.
Although there is a few gaffes. For example, you were saying that...
Trust Dustin to find the gaffes.
The battle at Helm's Deep, you had one issue with it near the end? No. There's another issue, and that is the birth of overpowered Legolas doing dumb shit.
Oh, yeah.
This movie, I think we talked about Legolas in Fellowship kind of mockingly.
Yeah.
But most of that mocking comes from The Hobbit and friggin' these movies now.
And this movie was the birth
of
the ridiculous Legolas.
My favorite character in the books is Gimli, because he is just this really like sensitive soul. He's easily moved. There's a point in the first book where he's reminded of a song about the old days in Moria that he sings, and he depresses himself and is just lost to the world for a while. And there's a point in Two Towers where he's absolutely dumbstruck by the beauty of the caverns behind Helm's Deep, and he's trying to get his buddy Legolas to come look at them, and Legolas is having none of it. And so, like, Legolas's role is, like, he doesn't take things as seriously. He's kind of lighthearted. He's a little bit aloof, and he's taken it upon himself to take care of his very sensitive, emotional friend. You don't see any of that interplay in the movies.
I disagree.
Gimli is comedy Scotsman.
One of my favorite scenes in this movie is when Legolas says to Gimli, "Shall I describe it for you, or shall I get you a box?"
That was very, very good and sweet. Yes, that was very good and sweet.
And then Gimli's like, "Oh!"
Because that moment is very true to who those two are. But
do they even say words to each other than that?
Not that often. And yet they're always, in the books, they're always talking together.
They're usually like barbs, or he's like, "Hurry up, we're running now."
But like, in the books, the two of them are inseparable. If Gimli has something he wants to talk about, it's usually with Legolas. And Legolas in the movies is not really much of anything personality-wise. And that's kind of a bummer to me. I mean, he does the thing where he surfs down the stairs on the shield and then surfs the shield right into the guy's collarbone.
No!
But he doesn't do the cool things that Bug Legolas does, which is, admittedly, mostly watching things and making jokes and helping to provide Elvish cultural context.
The Legolas thing that bugged me in this movie, that has bugged me since 2002, is when the horses are riding and Legolas grabs onto the horse's neck, and it's just the most bizarre digital effect of him swinging up onto the horse.
But from beneath, like underhand?
He like reaches around the horse's neck
the long way,
and then like goes the opposite direction of where you would expect him to sort of swing up. And that brings up another thing that frustrated me with this movie is slow motion. Peter Jackson, I'm trying to remember if he uses it in his other films, and I don't think he does. I think it's kind of exclusively for these Middle-earth movies. The slow motion was just really starting to get to me after a while. I'm like, this movie is long enough already.
The only slow motion I remember is when the captain of the elves dies, and Aragorn is watching this, and time slows down for him. He's like, oh my god. And you get this moment in the middle of this chaotic battle to sort of feel the weight of that, and then it goes right back immediately into the battle. Because you can't take a whole lot of time. You'll see all these other movies where somebody dies and they're just like, all right, that guy's obviously sad, so let's not attack him for the next 5 minutes while he weeps over this body. Here, they did a slowdown. They let you see that he sees it, he's reacting, but that the battle is still waging, so he doesn't have time to deal with this shit right now.
And that was a moment where I didn't mind slow-mo being used, where the slow-mo starts to drive me crazy. Like, I think up to that point, cumulative... all together. Like, there probably was like an hour of just little slow-mo scenes. And there's a moment where Frodo is having like a reaction and he's talking to Sam. I swear to God, they took a few frames out or whatever just to sort of like give the moment a little bit more molassesy feel. Just let it seep out rather than him just be like, "Oh, Sam, this sucks."
Potatoes and molasses.
Oh, and when they get into the bog and they go to that hard cut where it's Sam's
Yes.
foot going into the hole, and he pulls his foot out and he's like, "Oh, you've led us into a bog." And they go to a long shot, and as far as the eye can see, it's a bog.
yeah.
It's like you didn't just come out of the woods and step into a bog. Like, you've probably been walking in this bog for about a half an hour now.
My favorite dumb thing the characters say, and this is something that my sister has been yelling about for over a decade, is when Aragorn says to Legolas, "Legolas, what do your elf eyes see?" And it's like, I don't know, asshole, what do your human ears hear? Like, fuck off. And it's like, sometimes there are some dialogue choices that are
But Legolas, like,
bafflingly obvious.
when he asks him that question, he goes off and he looks, doesn't he? And he's like, "Yeah, they're..."
Oh, yeah, but it's just a silly thing to say. Of course his eyes are elf eyes.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay.
You could just say, "What do you see?"
What do you see?
What with being an elf and having better vision, you get a +2 to scouting. I've seen your character sheet.
I think we need to address Gollum.
And
What did
the
we-
CGI errors in this movie, we'll just put all that together.
This movie won an Oscar for visual effects. Mm-hmm. Well deserved. The effects in this movie don't stand out, in my mind, as prominently as they did in the previous film.
Good.
Feel that the animation and whatnot that they had going on Gollum was pretty crazy, pretty awesome. Does it live up 15 years later?
And I'd say the CGI, it's good unless there's any sort of action going on. The warg's going down the hill and starts fighting some people. It looks janky. You have Gollum jumping on the Sam and Frodo trying to attack him and get the ring. That looks like nonsense.
I thought you said Salmon Frodo, like the fish. Salmon Frodo.
Oh, yeah.
That was...
SALMON space capital F Frodo.
When Gollum jumps onto Sam and Frodo... When Gollum jumps onto Frodo and Sam and tries to get the ring back, he looks really odd. The CGI looks good until there's a lot of action going on and there's interactions happening.
Now okay, you said when there's a lot of action going on, pretty much 90% of Helm's Deep was digital.
Yeah.
But there it's all CGI interacting with CGI.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay, so you're saying when the CGI is interacting with real elements
Yeah.
and there's a lot of action going on, that's where it's janky. That makes sense.
When these movies first came out, like, Gollum was indistinguishable from the physical people in the film. Like, it was mind-blowing. It was absolutely cutting edge. But now, and this is the first time I've ever felt this way on my, I keep belaboring the point, but billions of watches of this movie. Literally millions. But this is the first time where I saw Gollum talking to Frodo, and I was like, this is some Roger Rabbit shit. And... that's the first time I've ever felt that way, that there was somebody who was digitally inserted into that scene. It always used to feel like he had a physical presence, and Mike, you brought up a very interesting point. Like, I thought it was just, like, aging technology kind of invisibly altering our expectations, but...
You mean about the high definition?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we all watched this movie in HD. When we saw this movie initially in theaters, when we saw it on home video, it was like... DVD, like the Blu-rays were not around. All of our extended cuts are DVDs. So we're watching it at a resolution where maybe some of those harder edges around Gollum being composited into the shots were a little smoother, and
when the quality
brings up the detail.
When the quality gets good enough that you can see every individual pore on Frodo's face, and you look at Gollum and you're like, that shit's smooth, something seems off here.
There was also a moment when the Ringwraith was flying over the bog looking for Frodo and his gang. There's like no shadow. There's no... I mean, it's overcast, but even if it's overcast, like, he still should be blocking what existing light is like coming down. And I mean, it's such a minor nitpick.
Yeah,
It's like
I
my
hadn't even
nitpick.
noticed.
It's like my nitpick about Gollum when I've seen the behind the scenes shots of Andy Serkis flailing around in the water and on the dirt. And I feel that there should be more elements with Gollum interacting with the ground, particularly when he's like happy and jumping around and kicking shit up and down. and there wasn't. And I mean, I chose to just kind of let it slide because considering everything else this movie got right on a technical level, it's a pretty minor nitpick. But I think those are the things for me that really showed the age of the CGI. Although, to be fair, this movie, like, this CGI is still better than some of the CGI I see in movies today.
Oh, yeah.
Helm's Deep is gorgeous.
Yeah.
It's honestly better than the stuff that I saw in The Hobbit.
Give me Gollum over the Emoji Movie literally any day. Also, The Hobbit.
The Hobbit has a quality and a texture to it that just can't compete.
It's a little cartoony.
It's a little cartoony. And it's not that they didn't use real elements. It's when you take those bits and pieces of, real environmental shots of New Zealand and then you color time them and composite them with other stuff, and everything just kind of gets flattened and smoothed out, and everything takes on this digital texture, which this is what people complained about with the Star Wars prequels. It's not that they didn't use real elements, like the Phantom Menace still has a ridiculous number of models and actual environments used, but it's the post process. It's when everything gets put together. This movie and The Fellowship also do not have that.
Yeah.
They still feel very tangible.
A lot of the shots in The Hobbit look like a desktop wallpaper.
Yes.
And that's, there's less of that in
and
this.
are about as entertaining.
About.
Dinger.
Wow. On the ball with the zingers today. And a lot of the things I was paying very close attention to the sound editing. And I noticed things like, since you mentioned the musical stings last time, I was focused on them. There were fewer of them, but there were two very, very small choices that they made that I zoomed in on. One of them was, at the beginning of the Battle of Helm's Deep, when the rain begins to fall, they don't play rain hitting stone or rain hitting earth. They play rain hitting metal. And they didn't have to do that. I certainly wouldn't have noticed if they'd played just a normal rain sound. But because the rain starts on a shot of Theoden, the fact that they play the sound of rain hitting his armor brings you closer into that scene. There's a lot of choices they made that they didn't have to make in this movie that are small but genuinely a sign of attention to detail that I love. The other one is the times that they decided not to subtitle the Elvish, which I think is very, very lovely and beautiful. Like when Legolas says his little prayer for Merry and Pippin, they don't subtitle it because that's not what this moment is about. It doesn't matter what he's saying. It matters that he's taking a moment to remember his friends.
Hearing you say those things kind of makes me want to go back and revisit the movie. Because as much as I felt like the things that you're describing are the things that I latched onto in the film, it was the quieter character moments like Merry and Pippin making their escape from the battle. For me, I was fishing for those moments where it drew you into the character and into the character story. I was less concerned with the world building. I was less concerned with, honestly, even where people were geographically. Like, I wanted to know more about what these characters were feeling and what they were going through. And I know that probably flies in the face of, the reason why I haven't finished the Lord of the Rings trilogy is because Tolkien's writing is very drawn out.
Yeah. And you get, because when Haldir shows up at Helm's Deep, Aragorn says you're very welcome, like he says you're welcome here. And then he says,
You are most
You're
welcome.
most welcome. Shit.
The most welcome.
And then, he approaches him, and he gives a little throwaway line in Elvish.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't subtitle. And then he just gives him this great big hug, and Haldir's what is happening here?
I love seeing Aragorn's face.
Yeah.
Because they show Haldir's face, and he looks uncomfortable. He's like, we're touching. I'm not comfortable with this.
It's like every time I hug a dude.
But then you see Aragorn from the other side, from his back. He's just got this look of joy.
Yeah, and relief, and just...
Yeah, and it was such a beautiful character moment.
And you get the sense from Haldir that he's like, well, this is Aragorn, this is my
I guess
buddy,
this is
we're
part
hugging.
of fighting once again with men.
Yeah, it's very,
What's
very
with men and their
sweet.
touching?
But the little line that Aragorn throws him is not what he says isn't important. The fact that in that moment he loses composure as a commander and is just overwhelmed at the sight of his friend is really nice. I also really like watching Aragorn and Theoden interact because you can tell that Aragorn's watching him and kind of forming his own ideas of what a leader should be by watching this king that he respects. And even when Theoden makes choices Aragorn doesn't agree with, you can still sense that respect is there and that Aragorn's watching him and thinking about the things he's doing. And I really
like that scene where they go into the stables and he's doing the thing that he's done, a bunch of times before, and he thinks it's going to work this time, but it's not going to work. But It's not like they have this big scene where he's trying to convince him. It's
Yeah.
They know the decision has been made.
Yeah, they
He's
respect
the king.
him.
You do what he does. You do what he says.
Like, they respect him enough to respect his decision. They don't agree with it. They're going to do their best to make it work. And, yeah, Aragorn was good in this movie, I think. But there were a lot of moments where you didn't have Aragorn come right out and say, like, I'm not sure if this is the kind of king I want to be. He's a king that I respect, and he's a man that I respect, but what kind of king am I? But you can see him forming those processes as he watches Theoden, and...
Aragorn and Sam are my favorite parts of this movie.
Yeah, like, Sam is a given. We haven't discussed how amazing Sean Astin is yet, but just assume that we've done it, because, shit, Sean Astin.
Speaking of Sam, my question watching this movie, and it has nothing to do with Peter Jackson, has to do with Tolkien. Why the heck did anyone give Frodo the ring? Just give it to Sam. He would have had this done months ago. He's got to carry his own ass, and Frodo's ass, and the ring. Just, Frodo, stay home. Sam's got this. He's the hero.
But why would Bilbo give Sam the ring?
Yeah.
He's the gardener.
Yeah, he's just the help, really.
That was one line that I really liked where he asks if Sam's his bodyguard. He's like, I'm his gardener.
Yeah, it's so good.
I like how he says it with such just gravitas. He's just, I'm his gardener.
That's like, Sam doesn't have a lot of initiative or momentum. Like, Sam will follow Frodo to the ends of the earth, but...
And will push him.
he will push, but he will push him from behind. Like, Sam wouldn't be the one to say, I'm going to undertake a journey. That would never be his idea or his
He's the support
volunteering.
Guy.
Yeah.
He's Porky Pig.
He's there on the mountain like, oh, Mount Doom looks like it's so far away.
Yeah.
Do we have to?
Yeah. And, like, that's not to say that Sam isn't courageous. He is. He just isn't daring, I think, typically.
I really like the little scenes when, they're watching the army kind of go by and he's just like, they never believe this at home.
Yeah, when they see the Oliphants.
It's a cool moment, and it kind of, you need those moments to remind you why these characters are out here doing what they're doing. The farther away they get from the Shire, that's the whole reason they're doing this. Like, you do get swept up in the whole Sauron and Mordor and Return of the King and fight and running at each other and whatever, but the elves are leaving town, The story at its heart is about saving, like,
two
what
guys
the Shire...
going hiking.
Well, not just... The thing that they're fighting for
Yeah.
is home, right? And home is the Shire, and you have to sort of... Because you never really see the Shire again. Because you don't get the scouring of the Shire at the end of the film.
Yeah, I'm always disappointed with that. The lack of the scouring of the Shire.
Oh, that's next movie.
Next movie.
The next trilogy.
Movie.
Well, I knew in Fellowship when Sam didn't get the box of dirt.
I
knew.
And that kind of reminds me, Merry and Pippin interacting with the Ents is also kind of very Shire focused because they're thinking of what's going to happen to their homeland. So, like, Sam and Frodo are thinking about what's waiting for them back home, and Merry and Pippin are thinking about what might not be waiting for them back home, which is very nice. But one thing I also noticed is, okay, here's just every huge nerd's problem with the Lord of the Rings trilogy of movies is that they cut out Tom Bombadil. It was a travesty. It was a travesty.
So.
Stop making that face.
Hey,
it's not good audio when you make that face at me. But
I've read enough Tolkien that I've read the Tom Bombadil, and it was unnecessary.
I've heard the audio books like a dozen times. I've had a lot of Tom Bombadil.
You guys are killing me. But Merry is from a portion of the Shire that is closer to the forest where Tom Bombadil lives. Another forest where trees are said to come to life. Another forest where trees behave mysteriously and have magical properties. And Mary's from Buckland, which is on the border where that happens. And you can tell, even though this was cut from the movies, this isn't part of the movies, the Tom Bombadil interaction never happened, getting attacked by Old Man Willow never happened, Merry interacts with the Ents differently than Pippin does. Merry's more immediately receptive to the talking trees and the magic of the Forest of Fangorn because even though they don't mention it, Merry's geographically just closer to this kind of thing.
Well, he does mention Buckland.
Yeah, but he doesn't...
Yeah, but you don't understand the significance of it unless you've read the books.
Yeah. If you've read the books...
But they still portray it in the film.
Yeah. They express that, like, Merry is closer to the idea of talking trees than Pippin. Even though they don't, A, they don't ever mention it, and B, they don't physically show it. So the fact that they take the existence of that area as canon, and they take it into their reckoning of the way Merry and Pippin react to things without ever mentioning it and having cut it entirely from the movie, I think kind of shows a real love of the source material, a real attention to detail.
I don't think there's any doubt that these guys, Philippa, Fran, and Peter, that they're not just total middle-earth nerds.
But, like, this is a labor of love for everybody involved. I mean, like, there were casualties. Broken toes, lost fingernails, fingerprints.
Faramir. Let's talk Faramir.
Oh.
It was a moment in the film. I mean, it's necessary to drive the plot forward, but it felt borderline just thrown in and unnecessary to me. I felt Faramir got short shrift. You said there's more of him in the extended cut.
There is a lot more of him, including like an elaborate flashback in which you see him interacting with his father and brother in Osgiliath. And you see how close Boromir and Faramir are, and Boromir trying to get their father to respect his little brother and failing, and Denethor just being super two of Faramir's lines are directly lifted from the speech his father gives him in that scene that was cut. When he says a chance for Faramir of Gondor to show his quality, and Faramir sends a mighty gift. Both of these were lifted from his father lecturing him in a really kind of snide, dismissive way.
This is jumping ahead just a little bit, but I know I'll forget this if I don't do it right now. There is that moment at the end where Faramir sets Frodo and Sam free, and he gets told, "You know the law of the land. To do so is...
Your life would be forfeit."
Your life would be forfeit. And he's like,
then
let
it
it be
forfeit.
Cut them loose. And it's like, if his life is forfeit by cutting them loose, why does he still have the authority to cut him loose? And after they cut him loose and his life is forfeit, why do they still let Frodo and Sam go?
Well, when you're in the middle of a war, the chain of command is all powerful. Yes, you might not like what your leader did, but you have to listen to your leader until things are calm, and you can go to whatever tribunal you have to deal with Faramir and what he did. But I will agree that when it comes to Faramir, I've always remembered his name. Always. I've always known Brother of Boromir. I know that he's up in the mountains at some point, picks up Frodo and them, but I can never remember what he actually does at all, what relevance he has to any action in the book whatsoever. Except for that he gives them some supplies. That's all I could ever remember from my many listenings to the audiobooks and the movies.
He's Eowyn's backup. Yeah, I think that's Return of the King extended cut, but she's definitely on the rebound there. But even though Faramir didn't get a lot, the fact that he was capable of coming face to face with the ring, looking at it, and turning it loose is really gorgeous, because it's like his brother couldn't.
That was a Sam moment, though.
It was definitely...
That was Sam stepping up and going, "You want to know why Boromir died?"
Yeah, but at the same time, I feel like...
the ring made him a little bitch.
If Sam had that moment with Boromir, he would have just been, like, decked. But he had that moment with somebody who was a little more thoughtful than Boromir.
True.
Who was able to understand what he was saying and who was like, all right, maybe I need to think for myself and not do what my father and brother would have done.
One does not simply shout at
One does not. That's a...
Not even the gardener of Frodo.
Land where gardeners are held in such high esteem. I also, I identify a lot with Faramir because, like, I have a sister, and our parents have always, decidedly had a capital F favorite. It's waffled because she was a very difficult teenager, so I was the favorite for a while. So, like, having a sibling that you're very close to, even though your parents don't really consider you equally, is, very, very close to home. So I love Faramir. That's the hill I'll die on. That guy's great. But, like, it sucks when your dumb sibling is the favorite. And they suck. Sorry, Christy. Don't listen to this, Christy. I love you. But a lot of Faramir got left on the cutting room floor because he's not a member of the Fellowship, and the Fellowship is already split. Like, I think they only had so much time to focus on characters who weren't.
You do kind of bring something up that maybe I didn't think about, which was, I said earlier that I think that this movie could theoretically be shaved down by half an hour. However, by doing that, it would lose some of those things that you were talking about, showing the fatigue, showing, certain things. But the Faramir scenes, I think, are one of the problems of the theatrical version over maybe the extended version. I haven't watched the extended version in a while, so I'm not sure just how much it changes his kind of being there. But clearly, it feels like shit's been cut. It feels like there's more there and they just couldn't squeeze it in. So maybe the theatrical cut is just a compromise in general. Like maybe if they wanted to just put out like a movie, just a tight sort of movie, you know, moving the characters where they have to be and focusing on the moments, they could have taken a half an hour out of it. But if you wanted to actually get, you know, the full experience, you need to watch the extended cut.
The thing is, if you take too much out and everybody is just there to drop plots and is just there to move from point A to point B, all of a sudden, you've got M. Night Shyamalan's Avatar: The Last Airbender. And we don't want that.
I know.
That movie needed another half hour, 45 minutes so that people had personality. So you cared.
I disagree that if you... Like the stuff that I'm not talking about just taking like huge swaths of things out. It's, you know, there's a few scenes of running that could have been shaved. That whole chasing the Uruk-hai, they're a day ahead, let's catch up. Like, how many times did you hear Gimli kind of go like, oh, we're made for sprinting, not long distance?
That could have been cut. I will agree with that wholeheartedly.
Yeah.
Like, there were so many scenes of let's check in again with our heroes who we were with 5 seconds ago and show them stop, look around, smell the air, and run again. We know they're in pursuit. I think just showing them tired would show how much they've run.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, like, I agree with you about the Faramir scenes. I think, like, most of the time you don't feel like things have been cut. But that time you do. Like, that time you genuinely, and like I said before, these editors have a deft hand. But there you feel something missing. And I'm not... there's a lot in the Chase of the Uruk-hai, now that you mention it, that was a little bit repetitive.
It was still done more competently than Fellowship of the Ring.
Oh, for surezies.
With the battle at the end.
Orc voices.
Well, those were better, too.
I don't remember orc voices in Fellowship.
I remember we were mocking the crap out of them because they're all...
Oh, that's right!
yeah, like
and there was some dumb shit voices this time, too. I just want to punch every orc when they're talking half the time. But the fact that there weren't quite as many talking was nice.
And there wasn't as much time spent hissing and mugging in general.
That's what bothered me, yeah. Like, I had no problem with any of the orcs in this movie. At all.
Yeah.
There were no unnecessary hisses at all. It was great.
There were the Greebly guys.
Yeah.
There were the Uruk-hai. There were the digital armies. Like, they served their purpose. They did their thing. They weren't... Yeah. No matter how the orcs were represented, they were... like, it never once occurred to me to be annoyed with them. I liked the Greebly guy that was trying to take out Merry and Pippin.
Yeah, I thought some of the voices they did for the Greebly guys were a little bit kind of shrill and hoarse.
Oh yeah,
in a way that was unpleasant to listen to, but not in like a oh my god, please fucking stop way. Just in a like oh this guy like.
Although I will always be disappointed that it doesn't have the marching to war song that they had in the animated movies. That song always runs in my head whenever I think of the orcs in these movies.
Don't talk to me about songs. I'm fresh from rereading. Like, don't talk to me about songs.
Let's talk a minute about Howard Shore. I remember I originally wanted to buy the Fellowship soundtrack because I like that theme, right? Like everybody loves that theme. I remember I got a Lord of the Rings soundtrack as a gift from someone close to me, but they purchased the Two Towers because it was the current one. And I remember complaining and being like, no, I wanted the other one, and I was given hell for being unappreciative.
And you broke the CD in front of their face and spat on it.
And ate it.
And as I listened to the CD, eventually the person admitted, yeah, you're right, the other one probably would have been better. This is just a lot of drumming and like, war music. And I'm like, it's the war movie! But watching the movie, I was that was in the back of my head. I was thinking about the music. I was watching for it to like overpower things, and I was watching for repetition and just loud war music. But I actually felt like there was way more score going on here than I ever gave this movie credit for.
Which goes back to Kat's comment about it being subtle.
Yeah, no, I said at the outset that I had a complex reaction to this movie because I will say that this is the superior of the three films. I think it's incredibly well made. I'm just sort of poking at the things that disappointed me. Yeah. Because when Fellowship, I loved Fellowship, and then I was disappointed by it. So I thought, well, I used to be disappointed by Two Towers. Maybe I will love it. I didn't love it. I quite liked it. I appreciated it, but it didn't wow me. So far, none of the Middle-earth movies are wowing me anymore, and I'm not sure if that's me becoming jaded or the fact that there's so much like fantasy stuff out there now.
Which I will treat as a segue as time is starting to run fairly long. So I will treat this as a segue to bring us to the deliberation portion and whether or not we're going to continue with our claim as last time that all three together are a classic, or in this case, now that we've updated the show, a masterpiece. Or if we think that it's getting downgraded to museum piece, or if we're going to take Two Towers out separately. And Mike, since you're the one facing the disappointment, I'm going to start with you.
It's everything I said. I think I was tempted at the end of Fellowship 2 to go and revisit the extended version. The pacing might feel more natural with other things being allowed to breathe. Or maybe I should just find a fan edit that's 2.5 hours long rather than 3.
Or you can make the fan edit yourself.
No. But I think this is the superior movie. I think it's a much more confident filmmaker. I think perhaps Fellowship was somebody going, how are we going to do this? Two Towers is somebody going, I know how to do this now. I'm much better at this. And Return of the King is maybe a little too confident. It's pushing it a little too far, going, oh, look at what we can do digitally and all that sort of stuff. We'll get to that when we get to Return of the King. I'm definitely in the position where Two Towers is the strongest of the three, or at least of the two to this point. Still had my problems with it. It's a tough call. I mean, I would maybe... You can't have this one without the other one, though. It's like Empire Strikes Back. I keep bringing back the Star Wars saga.
You can tell he's a bit of a Star Wars nerd sometimes.
Well, no, Empire is the better of the three of the original trilogy, but you can't have Empire without Star Wars.
Nor can you really have it without Return.
You can leave it open. But yeah, it's
a middle.
This movie is the middle, yeah.
You know it's a middle. And as I said last year, all three... It always felt like one movie to me. I'm watching it in 3 parts, but it is a minimum 9 to 12 hours worth of one movie, and altogether, it is a masterpiece. It is something that is exemplary in the world of fantasy movies. It's definitely a fantasy novel that's lived for a long time, and it's going to keep going on. And I wouldn't say that any individual movie is a masterpiece or museum piece, because it's all just the one, to me. It always has been, always will be.
I think I settled on masterpiece last time, but I was struggling with it because most of my arguments were based on the formative nature of this movie for fantasy movies, for our expectations of the fantasy epic, for our willingness to watch 3-hour movies. Thanks, Peter Jackson, for that. And so, even though I was saying masterpiece, I was making museum piece arguments, and I was making arguments that were based on kind of its position and its context instead of it in a vacuum. And I'm actually much more comfortable saying masterpiece this time around because The Two Towers is made with so much attention and love that it's crafted down to some very, very, very small details. It's beautifully made. It's much more sensitive than Fellowship. It's much more intelligent than Fellowship. Even though it can't be watched in a vacuum, I'm more comfortable calling Two Towers a masterpiece than Fellowship. Two Towers is a masterpiece. I consider Lord of the Rings as a whole a masterpiece, and I think I can do so much more easily now that I've seen Two Towers, which is unequivocally masterful.
And yet, Return is the one that got the Oscar.
They were clearly waiting.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. It was entirely political.
And who knows, we went into Fellowship expecting a movie that we adored, and we were underwhelmed. We went into Two Towers with tempered expectations, and we're pleasantly surprised, I think, is our general consensus.
This is the superior film?
Yeah. So what I'm saying is maybe we go into, we're expecting Return of the King to be worse than Two Towers.
I'm expecting it to be the worst of the 3.
So far, our expectations have been not exactly fulfilled, so maybe we'll be pleasantly surprised by Return of the King as well.
Except you have Legolas sliding down the trunk of an elephant.
Yeah, but he surfed a shield into a guy's collarbone in this one. I don't want to belabor the point.
That sounds so much cooler when you describe it.
It's true, actually.
Than it is to watch.
It's very painful to watch.
But when I watch it now, I see him log jumping in The Hobbit, so I know it can be so much worse.
Yeah, I can't judge them as a group until I see Return of the King.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say masterpiece, though. So far, I don't feel that any of these movies are masterpieces. Which is bothering me because...
And as I said...
15 years ago, I would have said, hands down.
I don't think any of them are masterpieces either, but as a whole.
I think the one thing we're most being shook by is the fact that 15 years ago, this would have been a much easier conversation. I think...
That is the point of the podcast!
Yeah, all of us were coming into this. How did I feel about these 15 years ago? 15 years ago, I thought Orlando Bloom was real fucking cool, and I gotta tell you, 15 years ago, I was dumber than I am now.
I can't do this, Sam. I know. It's all wrong. By rights, we shouldn't even be here. But we are. It's like in the great stories, Mr. Frodo. The ones that really mattered. Full of darkness and danger they were. And sometimes you didn't want to know the end. Because how could the end be happy? How could the world go back to the way it was when so much bad had happened? But in the end, it's only a passing thing. This shadow. Even darkness must pass. A new day will come. And when the sun shines, it'll shine out the clearer. Those were the stories that stayed with you. That meant something. Even if you were too small to understand why. But I think, Mr. Frodo, I do understand. I know now. Folk in those stories had lots of chances of turning back, only they didn't. They kept going. Because they were holding on to something. What are we holding on to, Sam? That there's some good in this world, Mr. Frodo. And it's worth fighting for.
Okay, I guess we'll leave it there.
Join us next time on Dumber Than I Am Now. Support our Kickstarter and we'll fly you to Hoppeton.
To Soundtown.
Sound Effects Town.
Yeah.
Thank you again. Thanks so much, Kat, for joining us for this conversation.
Had a great time.
And thanks in advance for joining us next year.
I enjoy talking movies with you guys. The pre-podcast podcast, the for real podcast, the podcasts we don't actually have, but we joke about.
There's like an hour of conversation before we even start recording.
We can't stop ourselves.
And that's not including the conversation we had in the car and the conversation I had with you yesterday, Mike.
We should just live mic the house.
Dustin said to turn the mic on.
Twice! I was denied.
And thank you for coming to listen to us, Internet. It's been lovely having you.
So that's our discussion on the Two Towers. If you guys have any opinions on our very meandering conversation, find us on any of the social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We've got the WordPress blog. If you get the show streaming or download off of iTunes, please rate and review the show. It helps get the attention with the Apple side of things.
If Mike and Dustin have said something that you particularly agree with, or they've said something bad about your friend's favorite movie, pass the show on to a friend. Word of mouth helps podcasts grow. We're also on YouTube. Show's doing quite well on YouTube. Join us over there if you're tired of downloading us to your telephone or whatever the hell you're doing. You're killing me. I'm dying.
If you put in the special tone into your telephone, you'll get this free game. For your own television.
Download our podcast. Stop. Next week we will be talking about Titanic. Stop.
Oh, is that ship which went down last week? Quick, send a carrier pigeon.
That's how we distribute the podcast.
We've gone off the rails a little bit.
Oh, jeez. So many times.
Be sure to join Dustin and me next week when we talk about James Cameron's Titanic, which celebrates its 20-year anniversary.
And we will see the state of our hearts after 20 years. Did they or did they not go on?
Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you next time on For Your Consideration. I'm Mike.
I'm Dustin.
I was Kat.
Take care.
Bye.
where he's jumping on this.
Would you
fish
like your
guy,
salmon
apparently.
Frodo grilled, sir? With a dash of lemon.
Today's special is the salmon Frodo. Can I recommend the house Chardonnay?
Comes with onion rings.
And the lady will have the salmon Frodo, please. Don't order from me. Fuck you. I want to stay.